So as Finn mentioned, I'm Ruth, and this is Sam, and we're the curators of Glimmers of the Radiant Real, which started at the RMG, our host institution, in the summer, and it's touring. So we're going to the McIntosh in London after here in 2019, and then to the Reach in Abbotsford, BC in 2020. So all these works are going to get lots of movement through the world. So today's roundtable discussion will explore some of the themes in the exhibition, and we have two guests joining us. We originally had three, but unfortunately Siobhan could not be here today for reasons beyond her control. And so yeah, we hope you enjoy the discussion, and we do invite you to enjoy the exhibition and the refreshments afterwards. So our panelists today are Vanessa Nicholas. She is a PhD candidate in art history and visual culture at York University, where she is researching the environmental history and ecological significance of historical Canadian textiles. She holds a Shirk Joseph Armand Bombardier Canada Graduate Scholarship and is the 2019 Isabel Bader Fellow in Textile Conservation and Research at Queen's University. And she also wrote one of the essays in our catalog.
And yes, round of applause for Vanessa. And at the end of the table is Nick Glode, and she is the curator at the Varley Art Gallery of Markham. She holds a BFA from the University of Ottawa and a master's degree from Newcastle University. She has curated over 25 exhibitions, including Brendan Fernandez, Imposition Mother Tongue, and Xiaojing Yan, Out from Among the Tranquil Leaves. And that's Xiaoqing's Peace Cloud Cell, just kind of behind where everyone's sitting. And her curatorial interests revolve around the relationship between place, memory, culture, gender, and identity. So, and so let's just launch right into our questions. We have prepared a series of questions for our panelists, and we're just going to see where the conversation goes. And then once towards the end of our conversation, we'll open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions for us. So let's launch right in. We'd like to know how the ideas of radiance that are in this exhibition fit into your own work and research.
Thanks, Sam. When I think of radiance and about this show, the first thing that comes to mind is light. A lot of the works kind of reflect light or retract light. And for an institutional curator, light is a bit of the bane of my existence. I do have a love-hate relationship, and I'll end on the love. So at the Varley, we show both historical and contemporary art, or modern art. And when you have a collection of historical art, especially works on paper, then light can be a damaging factor. So you're always dealing with light levels, so the idea of how bright something is and how it interacts with special media, watercolor, for example. So I'm always thinking about that sort of thing. You know, if you're looking at a delicate print and the glass is kind of, you know, bouncing the lights off, that's not good for the viewing public either. But eventually, you're always battling between, do you want people to see these works, or do you want it to be dark enough so that they last for another 100 years? As we all know, I wear glasses, my eyesight is not very good, and so if it's too dark in the gallery and you can't see, what's the point? So that's the kind of downside. The upside is that lighting in an exhibition can be a really important way to create an ambiance. And so I'm thinking specifically for the solo show that I did with Xiaojing, where not only did we have kind of a theme for the exhibition, but the lighting design played a really integral role. And so lighting isn't just to illuminate, but you can use it to various degrees to create mood. So I'll kind of end at that.
Hello, sorry, microphones freaked me out. Thank you for your introductions and your question. For me, when I think about radiance and the themes of this show and my own work, so my research subject or objects are 19th century quilts and coverlets, things that are distinctly unshiny and also in a lot of cases very faded, and they're material integrity has been compromised over time. So while my research subject isn't shiny per se, I think the theme of the show for me is more about surface and as I said, the integrity of surface and the value of surface decoration and adornment and things that are typically seen as secondary or sort of delegitimized, I think, maybe in the fine arts and by institutions. And so I think about this show as trying to recover that value or trying to think about that value in a different way or giving it some love, basically. So yeah, that's how I think about it in relation to my work.
Thank you, both of you. So, Anik, I'm really interested in how you were talking about this idea of sort of changing the mood, and it also sounds like kind of the relationship between the spectator and or the audience member and the work is something that you're cultivating. So I'm wondering, how does the nature of the work change how you manage that relationship?
Yeah, definitely. And there's a bit of a difference, and I'm not sure how familiar the audience is between the different types of curating there is. So as an institutional curator, and we don't do many tours like this, I'm always in the same spot. So you do get to know your space very well, as opposed to if you're a freelance curator, you're kind of, you work in different spaces all the time. And so things like, I mean, I love exhibition design. Like that's one of the things that I love the most about my job. And I'll be honest that the lighting bit is only something that I've been thinking about in the past few years, namely because our lighting system is very frustrating, but just naturally the type of exhibitions that I've been working on. But definitely, as a curator, you're always conscious about how you interact with objects. I'm definitely more attracted to sculpture and installation. And so because you have a relationship to the body with the work, so you're kind of forced to walk around it, to, you know, even something like this, you have to start and walk all the way. So in terms of lighting, what it can do is really dictate kind of the path that the audience member can take. So you're telling a story through the lighting or through the effects that you can generate with that.
Thanks, Anik. So yeah, that's really interesting because I think at least for Sam and I with these works, there is that the work itself, because it's projecting light as well, it's changing again the space around it. And so how all of you and all of us move through the space and interact with the works, you're creating different ways of seeing it and seeing a relationship to yourself. And so, Vanessa, I'm curious, because you have such an interest in these questions and adornment, and this is also kind of this, it's not so much getting close to a work, but oftentimes, especially with the kind of textiles that you work with, it's putting things on the body and projecting outward through how you're using adornment. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that side of it, the way that, yeah, how do you see adornment reflecting sort of that projection aspect?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm thinking about, so the beginning of the essay that I wrote for you guys, I cited an article from an online teen girl magazine called Rookie Magazine, where they wrote an article called "Glitter is literally the best thing ever." So in terms of like the body and this idea of projection, I think this idea of adornment, but particularly shininess or glittery things being transformative and helping you project maybe a part of yourself outward. And it kind of gives you like this idea of adornment and shininess and gilding encasing you, but also projecting some radiance outward into the world that maybe you feel that otherwise is hidden inside of you. Yeah.
So it puts something that you already maybe have or feel on the outside, and that allows it to come forward in a way that it might not otherwise.
Yeah, I think this idea of, if we think about this idea of light and sparkle as energetic, in that way, maybe you're bringing something to the outside, this idea of your inner energy coming out and being able to project outwards, perhaps.
Anik?
I just wanted to add something. Where you're thinking about light, you're thinking about sparkles. Naturally, the opposite of that is darkness, and I think that's something very important that we think about and that make up a work. So I'm kind of looking at that. You see the shadow of the string underneath, or you see other kind of reflections, and so sometimes it's as important to think about what's not there than what is kind of in your face.
Well, that kind of leads us into another line of questioning, specifically thinking about shine as a surface condition, and the way that shine is often seen in a superficial context. And for us, when curating the show and so many of the objects in the show, they're really about surface. And the surfaces mediate a relationship with the object and our interpretation of it. So specifically, the sculptures that are on the floor, kind of just behind the audience, by Catherine Telford-Keogh, there is a piece of glass over top of the objects that are encased in it. So our experience of those objects is mediated by a piece of shiny, reflective glass. And then we were also thinking about the video work, which is just kind of behind that barrier, that fake wall there, by Sanaz Mazinani. And what happens in that piece is that the video is reflected in mirrored glass that is fractured in itself. So there's this multiple layers of fracturing happen based on a surface condition. And then the other piece we were thinking about in constructing the specific question, also thinking in the show, is a work by Katie Bethune-Leamen, which is just behind us, and she adds a layer of surreal into her video with the objects, and also the relationship between the sculpture, which is, you can't see it, it's just behind us on the floor, and also the character in the film. So would like to know how you think about the idea of mediating surface, and how does it change the approaches in your own work?
Sure. Well, I would actually also add to that maybe Mary Pratt's work, because I think that painting has you have such a layered response to that painting, because you're obviously attracted to the shininess of her subject, but also the surface itself is kind of, you register it maybe first as a photograph or really photographic, and then you realize it's a painting, and so you're attracted to the shiny tactility of the subject, but also you kind of want to touch the painting for some reason. So I think that her work also kind of plays into this. But yeah, I think if I think about materials and layers and mediating our experience of it, I mean, I guess, yeah, in terms of my own work, thinking about quilts and coverlets and beds and layers and warmth. So this idea of this maybe bodily aspect of layering, that's, at least in my own work, something that's literally keeping you warm and alive. There's something very vital about it, and something that, your body heat and the quilts and the bedding are like literally relating to one another, and so thinking about like tactility of materials and how that relates to the body, I guess, is something that makes me think of.
And it's funny how often, I think that quilt, talking about the way we think of quilts and bedding, is it's back and forth too, right? So whether it's light or a shiny thing, or it's something that's keeping you warm, it's not just a one-way thing. How you're receiving it and amplifying, going back and forth and trying to catch it in.
Yeah, and that reminds me of the Broadbent Sisters video too. So they represent the transformation that the woman goes through with that shiny covering that she envelops herself in, and she's walking in the desert, but she has this kind of protective foil around her. So there's something there as well, I think.
So I think the work in the show that deals with issues that I'm working on at the moment are the series of the Broadbent Sisters paintings in the hallway. So I work with, apart from doing contemporary shows, I do work with a historic collection with landscapes of the group of 7. And so we have a collections gallery, and we do rotating shows of different things, but landscape painting. And I've been thinking a lot about how these landscape paintings have become so iconic in kind of the Canadian imagination, and how they've really mediated our relationship with nature, especially people that live in the city that might see these paintings of Algonquin Park, for example, and you kind of think, okay, that's how it was at that day when they came. But that might not be true at all. And so thinking about how a frame literally kind of, contains your view of nature, and it's kind of delineated by this canvas size. And so a show that I is on right now called Inscapes really hopes to encourage the visitor to kind of go beyond that and think about, okay, this is one example of, but what does this landscape mean to you? Does it mean anything? So when I saw the show initially, I didn't realize that you could take your phone and look through your lens to look at the Broadbent Sister painting, and then you saw it in a completely different way. So I think that really speaks about how we engage with different artworks, how the meanings are very layered depending on who you are and what your experience is, and that's okay. And I think that at first when I started, and I have to say I've never done a show quite like this that kind of focuses on texture as kind of the opening point, but definitely is giving me tons of ideas for other shows. Where was I going with this?
Landscape, scene, the different reactions.
Yes.
of the viewer. Yeah.
Sorry. That at first, when I was developing my projects, you're very kind of set on the message. This is the message I want to give. But the reality is, as people come in, they all have different interpretations, and that's okay. And I think when we think about mediation, that's exactly what we're talking about, is that everyone has their own baggage and their own ideas of what a work is, and that's fine as well.
So this is taking us slightly off topic. I love this idea of the mediation of something through something else. And for us, when we were in kind of the early days of thinking about what works to include, the Broadbent Sisters film, we loved the kind of trail of the foil as it moves through this landscape. And then they kind of said, well, you watch it through your phone. And then we said, what? And then, and then it becomes something different. And I think that that's part of the kind of magic of also their drawings, which we added in as well. And there is a really wonderful relationship that I think is captured in the hallway space between the Broadbent Sisters' work and the Mary Pratt. And I think for us as emerging curators, I guess that's our title, and especially because we're taking this to different venues, it gives us a chance to kind of play and restage and reconfigure the show 4 times, which is a really unique thing that not a lot of people will get to do. And as we've been doing that, we've been kind of figuring out relationships between the works that we didn't think of initially. And one of those relationships is the relationship specifically between the Broadbent Sisters film and the Mary Pratt the Christmas dinner, which is the idea of, which Vanessa touched upon a little bit, this idea of covering yourself in a shiny coating. So thinking about this idea of covering yourself in shine, this idea of perhaps shine or foils being slightly otherworldly and very different than this world that the kind of straying away from the natural world. So the sensation that we have when we cover ourselves in shine, is it an escape? Does it represent some type of potential change in ourselves, change in the way that we're seen, like a some type of change potentially leading to maybe an idea of utopia. And is this something we should be wary of, or something we should completely embrace as an escape through shine?
Okay, I'm afraid this might go in a different tangent altogether. I guess I'll start by saying that what I've been interested in lately is the idea of the in-between, or something that bringing in things into the gallery that doesn't quite fit the definition of fine art, maybe. And craft is definitely a good idea of that. And I think, already I'm like, ooh, so many things we need to talk about. But I think that this idea of shininess, this idea of something that's not quite natural, or actually there's a lot of natural things in the world that are shiny, but this idea of, and I'm always thinking about, the meaning of bringing something into the gallery and what does that mean. And the idea of reflecting that, there's been, in the notes, there's a thing about like shiny hot pants or something like that. So in fashion, there's been shiny things forever, jewelry and, all sorts of things. So to me, maybe it's, I'll talk about, the future, but maybe it's actually talking about the past and talking about the right now. And maybe the art world hasn't caught up. Like, I think there's some interesting ideas in there, and that if somebody wants to use sequins, and you definitely are seeing that in contemporary textile works, that they're using materials that are not typically textile related, which is really exciting. But I'm also a big science fiction fan, so when I see these kind of things, like I definitely think, but maybe it's kind of a 60s or 70s versions of the future, so yeah.
Yeah, it's funny how our ideas of past and future change, and I think one of the interesting things, Vanessa, so if you haven't checked out Vanessa's essay in the catalog, I recommend it, it's very good, but it's also like exactly as you said, I think there's this funny relationship between past, present, and future, and we think about, shine as artificial or as like outside of the art world, maybe more like a design or fashion thing, but for your essay, you went back to looking at medieval art and how these different kind of surface treatments and ways of thinking about things as precious and beautiful come through the art world in very different ways at different times. So I wonder if you want to say something about that?
Yes, I have lots to say about it. I think it's funny, looking at the show, my first inclination was, as you say, to go to the medieval period. I was thinking a lot about reliquaries, especially in Cole's work, so these beautifully gilded bugs, but also the gilded bones in the case up there. So he's really making almost religious or magical these kind of everyday things, or bugs we typically would want to squish, or bones that we would throw away. He gilds them so that we renew them in some way and attribute some special value to them. And I think that similarly throughout the show, I think craftsmanship is such a strong theme, which I think also resonates with this idea of medievalism. And in terms of the natural world, I think this all relates as well, because for me, thinking about environmental philosophy and environmental theory, there's really seen as like the kind of moment that we start hurtling towards the ecological apocalypse, which we're currently in. That's really seen at the rupture between the medieval period and the early modern period. So this idea of abandoning some of the medieval organicism is seen as part of the long-standing reason why we're now in a present ecological crisis. And so in thinking of utopia, there is a kind of tendency, at least amongst environmental thinkers or philosophers, is to see the medieval period as some sort of utopia of thought around the environment, because things were more kind of holistic at that time. People regarded themselves as more part of a living system as opposed to the human nature binary that starts to break during the modern period. So in thinking about these things and medievalism and craftsmanship, I did see an environmental theme as well. And I wish Siobhan were here because she speaks a lot to the relationship between metals and nature. And so this idea of otherworldliness that's evoked through shininess and gold is actually very superficial because it requires mining and really destructive extraction industries in order to get that material. And so she'd probably have a lot to say about that, but I think that that's an interesting thing to think about. But definitely that otherworldly quality is very present in the show. I mean, the bugs are stars, you know, and we have this meteorite behind us. It's very transporting. And similarly, in the medieval period, they're gilding in order to create heavenly space and to attribute objects with an otherworldly quality, so that's long-standing as well.
Yeah, and I think this idea of nature is really interesting, and also fits with some of what you were starting to say, Nick, about this, 1960s and 70s idea of like the future will be shiny, everything will be glowing, and this idea that that was always artificial. And I think you look at like Xiaojing's work, which is a natural object, and even in some of our conversations with Sandy, is this idea that when you're trying to make iridescence in art, you're not trying to make something that's not, you're trying to do something that nature can do and that you've been unable to mimic, whether it's like a bird's feathers or a fish's scales. There are these properties that we sort of go through the artificial trying to find when they are in nature. And so I'm wondering, Anik, maybe to finish us off, if you have any more thoughts about this future, but also going back to what you said about this relationship between light and dark, that these are things that also show up under certain conditions, that they need the dark to be able to see some of them and to see them fully. And I wonder whether you think that, I wonder what you think that means, or how that changes what we get out of it in terms of thinking about our past and our future and our relationship to different kinds of work.
I guess I'll start. Oh, that's a lot of questions.
It was a lot of questions, Jess.
I guess
Take it slow.
I'll start by talking about time, which we've kind of alluded to a little bit. And a lot of the works here reference time, or, you know, either we're talking about geological time or, you know, past, and we've kind of talked about this past and future, and how we picture time to be, but they allow us to experience time. And whether that's from the point of the curator who's installing these works, or you know, kind of more performative aspects. And I think that's really interesting. And naturally, when you think about time, you think about that cycle of day and night and light and dark. And I think, and specifically, I'm kind of, as you know, I'm looking at this work here. Time to me also talks about how we want to memorialize. Sorry, commemorate. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of that here as well, and how time has an effect on you're trying to kind of gild or add something precious to, or use something precious to do that, or to kind of bring forth something that otherwise we might not see. And I think, you know, knowing Xiaojing's work very well, the pearl by itself might seem very precious. You think of kind of a pearl necklace, but thinking about all of these pearls together, kind of showing a stopped moment in time, like a cloud formation forming, it makes you think about all those things. It makes you think about the people that are picking up the pearls, the people that kind of put it together, but also your own relationship to a cloud, for example.
Kind of this tension between things that are lasting, and then this sort of ephemeral experience, that everything is very temporary, which also goes back to what you were saying about these relationships to the natural and to the geological too. I think that's an interesting way of rethinking some of the time, the relationships to time that are present in a lot of these works. I mean, certainly Katie's, but also Dan's, which is, I mean, it started as a performance and it ends up, it's very temporary materials. These are not things that are meant to last, but they are like, it's a preservative, right? You cellophane something up to keep it safe and to keep it keep it closed.
And I think just going back to this idea of light and dark and the kind of the atmosphere that you can create. I once went to a show that was in complete darkness, that you traveled with like a light lamp thing, and it was to show what was missing. So not what was there, but what was missing, which was quite, and you know, in the sense it didn't really matter. The show was about comic books taking over the museums, and it was kind of, the paintings were missing. So it was to kind of bring attention to what museums put value on. So this idea of value was really interesting to me, but it just changed your entire perception. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to get at, is that by, you know, adding the gold to these insects, or by, you know, bringing these different materials into the gallery, you're changing your perception of them. And that's why I find, you know, really interesting, for example, with that work over there, by using, or even the saran wrap, you know, you're using saran wrap in a different way. You're really highlighting its, you know, the properties of it, whereas if it was in your kitchen, it would be completely different.
Uncovering what's present and using it to change the setting, to change the score a bit. So I think, do you have any final comments? I think we're going to open it up to questions from our audience members. Does anyone have any questions? I can pass this actually if people want to. If anyone wants to be mic'd.
It is handy if people speak into the mic, as I did not at the beginning, so I apologize for that. I was going to say, I don't know if it's probably more of a comment as you do, but I really love this bringing forward of the idea of things sort of being steeled, like S-T-E-E-L, or frozen, or commemorated, or memorialized, or whatever, and also to note for the audience that the video has been paused. This isn't the full extent of it, but I was that was kind of striking to me while thinking about it, but also thinking about these materials that are quite temporary, and bringing in this environmental aspect. They're temporary in terms of their uses, but quite long-standing in terms of their time, and this idea that you know, that kind of waste and this sediment that builds up, we're kind of creating the resource banks of the future, right? And those future, like, odd mines that, I don't know. Anyhow, comments?
Maybe Vanessa, do you want to start off on that?
Yeah, well, the other thing that I had in my mind coming here, I recently heard, I don't know if it was podcast or radio, I mean, specifics are lost on me, but the point is they were talking about glass and how much glass is being used as obviously a modern building material in condos, and how that seems like coming out of nowhere, but actually that the world's sand reserves are totally depleted, and they're having to make sand from these other resources that it's just not working as well. And so thinking about the finite amount of sand in the world and glass, but also these glass towers that are going up that aren't really that permanent in terms of their structural integrity, and then what's going to happen to them, and where do those resources go, and thinking about these weird mines of the future is actually really interesting in terms of that kind of the relics and monuments we're going to leave behind or something. But yeah.
And also this idea of decay too, that I think is really interesting to think of when we're talking about materials that are sort of more thought of as more precious, or that have this preservative quality. And so when you think of Catherine's work, for instance, you've got the surface that's creating, but it's also the objects are not preserved there. You can look and you can see where they've started to collapse and they started to decay within the resin. So it's anticipating that and asking what is this almost alchemical process that's going to give us something that we don't understand where it's going yet.
And that's why I would suggest for this show, but also any other show you might see, really consider the material that the artist is using, and that it's not, it's often multi-layered. I mean, we've kind of talked about that. And it might not be obvious at first, but that material really talks about, a lot of things. And this idea of how a material came to be and how the artist got it, or the experimentation that the artist had to go through, or how something so kind of either precious or fragile can actually reflect on something completely different, like, the development of the earth type of thing, like the billions of eons.
Well, I think that's, like touching on that, that's something that in working with some of the artists, we were having a lot of conversations about materials and where they came from and what the materiality of what they were doing means to the work and how much the materials really do inform the work. And I think that that's kind of, if we can have another question, I think, what does it mean for artists who decide to use shine as a medium? I'm thinking like particularly of Sandy, who has built a career from using foil and manipulating foil, and he's just a master of foil, and his studio is filled with foil, and he knows everything about it and is so passionate about it. And maybe that's just one particular example. But I think, and we've talked about a little bit with craft, but that people who really understand, who have shine or shiny materials, whether, and perhaps this falls more into the category of craftsmanship. I'm thinking specifically of people who might make bracelets out of resin or acrylic, and there's this real fine understanding of how to make it shine. Someone who is a ceramicist and really is a master of glazing, that's all about shine and reflection of light. Someone who's a metalsmith knows how to buff something so it's going to shine. And I think that we've touched on how these things don't really fall into so much into a category of a fine art discussion, but if you felt that maybe there was room for those things to be discussed more, as within the idea of some of the things we've talked about, with like shininess being ever present in our world and what that means. And yes, we were specifically thinking of glass-sided buildings. In Ruth's essay, she mentioned an app that adds sparkle to anything when you look through it.
It is very fun. I highly recommend you try it.
It's so good.
It's the Curated app. It makes everything really like.
And and of course, metallic hot pants. So I guess this is a very long-winded question, but how do we talk about shine in a fine art context? And how do we talk about these materials that don't necessarily fall into usual categories? Like, how can we open up our discussions more and to be more material focused about how light really does play a unique role as a material? Like, do we need to list in our material lists, houseflies, gold, the thread and light?
I think it would be interesting to hear maybe from the visitors and how they, as visitors, reacted to this, seeing these kind of materials in the gallery. Anyone?
Anyone? Oh, yeah. Okay.
It's handy for the video.
I think it's interesting with an exhibit that's dealing entirely with reflectiveness, reflection, shine, that sort of thing, that the lighting of the exhibit is as much a part of the artwork itself as the very piece. And so with something like this, I think it's almost necessary to consider the exact type of light, how it works. I imagine there's a number of challenges moving an exhibit like this because you need to have that sort of exact display of light on it to show the artwork the way the artist may have wanted it to be shown.
Yes, so you're quite astute in your observations. So this is one of the challenges, and I think when you conceptualize, I mean, like Anik said, when you're thinking about the exhibition design, you're thinking about how you're laying out work, you're thinking about, a lot of things from like, you do not want people to accidentally trip over the artwork because that would be bad for everyone. But when you start dealing with things that are delicate, and I think when you have such reflexive works, the viewing experience is kind of delicate. You need to give the work enough, but not too much too, because if you make things too brightly lit, the viewer won't be able to see properly what the full range of things that the piece is going to do. And I mean, Sandies are probably the most challenging for this because they have different kinds of reflectivity that are built into each work. And so when you're relating these pieces, you're kind of gambling that you're going to be able to see all of them. And that's really challenging. Sam, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, apart from the actual installation of these works, I think what was really magical to us was the first time that we actually unpacked them, because we were seeing everything, again, talking about surface mediation, through screens, whether it was, a laptop screen, an iPhone screen, an actual photograph of something, but none of that shininess really comes through. And then it was when we first unpacked them that we kind of, Sandy's especially, they just took on this whole otherworldly quality, because as you move, the piece shifts, and kind of like a bird's feathers or any type of animal that has, or a fish scales, it's about the movement around the piece, and that really doesn't come through in photographs or in the kind of screen mediation. So I think that the role of light plays a large role in kind of the magic that we experience when we come see the show, and thank you to everyone for coming to see it in person. And hopefully some of that translates into the documentation of it, for future research and other purposes like that. But unfortunately, until we can, get apps and special cameras that specifically shift and capture light in that way, the ability of light and the camera, which is a very unique relationship. A camera is completely nothing without light, and some of the magic and sparkly qualities of it don't come through in that space. So that was something that when we first experienced the show and we're walking around it, kind of being able to say, oh wow, it actually reflects, it actually shines, it shifts, it changes, and a lot of those surface qualities only come through in person, again with the correct lighting. So the show without light would not sparkle in person and would look pretty dull if we were to show it on film or in a book.
Yeah, we always leave at least a day for lighting, right? And I mean, being in the space, we don't have working lights, so often it's quite strange. I mean, when we're beginning to install a show, we're working with the lighting that's specifically been designed for the show prior. So you have these odd sort of hotspots, and I don't know how your lighting system is, but ours is ancient.
I have to get onto a skyjack.
Right, okay.
And so I do see the lighting from the sky, so it's completely different.
Completely different, yeah. Lighting is such an odd thing. We don't have to go skyjack, but we do have like a big sort of Home Depot staircase thing that moves around. And yeah, I mean, we have to have a spotter on the ground and somebody being the hands, and also the presence of the artist when possible is so valuable. So in particular for Sandy's pieces, we sort of knew that we weren't going to have them properly lit until he was here, and he was able to come just like an hour before the opening, and we were like, okay, I've got the ladder, we're ready to go. Because yeah, I think so much of it comes to light. I'm not so sure about including it on the labels though, because there's these other elements that have to do with the way something is presented, and then the way you subconsciously approach it, right? About like space and placement, and I don't know. I think even the floor. You're gonna see this, right? Different spaces are gonna have different floors. The way the ceiling is, the way the corners are in the gallery spaces. So. Yeah, it's such a funny thing, and I think so much of that resides in the subconscious mind of the audience. I kind of love it to sit there as just this invisible thing, but it might be different for certain pieces.
Does anyone else have any questions For us, for Anik, for Xiaojing, do you have a question? This is Xiaojing.
Thank you so much for the discussion and answers for the questions. And I learned so much about the surface, and I never really thought about. But also it make me to start thinking more about it, and I kind of wonder. What's the the psychological kind of implications about artist choice, or of the shyness level? Because some culture may think the shyness is as a way of drawing attention, and so it's kind of, I don't know if you have ever looked into that.
Do you have any thoughts? I think this fits with some of what you were talking about, different mentalities in terms of how you or philosophies of thinking about the world, the medieval stuff.
Yeah, I think shine and sparkle is a really difficult topic, actually, because it has these extremes. So it can be really joyful, but it can also be really kind of dark and melancholic if we think about it in terms of waste or capitalism or these kinds of things, or it can be, just really joyful and beautiful, and something that people are just attracted to, and brings aesthetic joy, and that I think that that's actually so valuable as well, just in and of itself. So yeah, I kind of struggle with that question, actually. I'm not sure what the psychological kind of ramifications are of shine or shininess, whether it's something, I think, as you guys were asking earlier, if it's something that should be, if we should be wary of it, or celebratory about it. It's kind of, maybe the context is really what matters, and how we frame shininess. Maybe that's how we can differentiate the different types of shine and the different kind of implications that they have, both on the world, but also on our own, in our own minds and in our own understandings of ourselves and the world, I think. Because I think that shine can bring lots of different implications depending on how it's used or where it's used.
I guess I would add that it kind of is not an answer for the psychology, but as a curator, you would hope that the artist, if it's someone that's very invested in something, that has taken the time to research a specific aspect of it. And that's what I find really interesting, is when you do meet someone that has spent, years researching the practice of gilding or something like that, and then they do use it in a different context. And hearing them and that's a bit of, or all the job of the curator is to kind of get that information out or ask questions that maybe they wouldn't have asked. So for me, it's not really about finding the big reason. Maybe what is the reason for that person? Like, why would that person pick that? Like, why did you spray paint or paint the cicadas to be gold? It is a completely different reason why I would do it, where somebody else would do it. So I think it's a very individualized question, and then how do you either bring it to a larger context, or, if it's a solo show, it's one thing. If it's a group show, then okay, how do you make those links between the different psychologies?
Yeah, I might actually just add something too, 'cause you reminded me as well of just this idea also of glitter, as I spoke to earlier, this idea of adornment often being associated with femininity and being derided particularly for that association. And so there's some kind of powerful, maybe reclamation project around shine and adornment that relates to gender or, the specific maker, perhaps, which I think is important as well to think about.
I think we have time for one last question. Does anyone have anything they want to know about the show, about our work in particular, questions about some of what we've been talking about? Yeah, it kind of changes how, yeah. what you see.
I was just going to ask a technical question about how, when you're doing an installation that's this complex, how the heck do you pull them out of the boxes?
With a lot
Yes.
of preparation and luck.
Does the artist have a chart for the wall project?
Yeah, so Coles is the most complicated to install for reasons that I think are evident once you look at the piece. So he has to come in and install, and he deinstalls the piece as well each time. Yeah, there are over 100 bugs on the wall.
And each time he's going to be refreshing the bugs, because one of these things that happens just naturally with these objects which are organic and in a state of decay, whether or not they've been gilded or steeled to a certain extent, they're going to dry out and continue to fall apart. And Hannah was here helping us with the install of this piece in particular. And it's true, so he came with a drawing or sort of a diagram of what this would be that specifically related to star charts. And that was projected, and that's how it began. And everything then was drawn onto the wall. And then from there, each of was the string second or last?
Yeah, Hannah was most involved in this one, so she's probably the best one to answer this question.
I mean, I'm hesitant because I don't want to reveal any secrets. Is there any?
No, he's very open about his process, yes. It's fine.
So the holes are actually drilled in the wall, and then we used glue to put a pin into each of the holes. And then the process of putting on the thread is spontaneous, so he's sort of just responding to the moment and the shapes that he really likes. So this, in addition to the holes being in a different place from last time, the lines are changing each time. Exactly, yeah. And I think this is an interesting tidbit as well, that the constellations are made from maps that map where the bugs were found.
Yep.
So there's a real interesting connection between how they are on the wall and where they're found. And then the bugs are added after the thread.
So there's refreshed bugs that come into it each time it's shown, which also feels like a seasonal addition too. And this one had a number of cicadas and huge dragonflies, which weren't in the first one, simply because of what he had access to.
And the other thing to add with this piece, which is called Monument, it will have 4 different iterations for each show. So this is Monument 2, and it will be different in every space based on the amount of space that Cole's able to have, the bugs that he has available. Every time he deinstalls them, some of them don't make it. And, some... Yeah, we lost some flies. We gained some other bugs. So for him, he was speaking about this project as evolving each time. And so if you look at the little plaque, it says that it's phase 2, and it will change each time that it's installed. And we've been really lucky that Cole has been so generous with his time for all the iterations of the exhibition, that he's been able to come and install and deinstall and think about this piece in the context of each exhibition. So if that's it, then I guess we can wrap up. So first, we'd like to thank Vanessa and Anik for coming today and sharing their thoughts on the show. We'd like to thank everyone in the audience for coming and for your great questions. We have some very generous sponsors and donors who made the show and the catalog possible. So just thank you to them. They're not here, just thank yous out in the air. And we'd also like to thank the whole team at the Art Gallery of Peterborough, who have been so generous in their time and everything they've done for the show and to put on this event. And there are some snacks upstairs. So if you'd like to hang around, have some...
Yeah, that's true. We've got some refreshments upstairs. And before we disperse, I did just want to mention that we have a couple of other thank yous to insert. So of course, thanks to the whole panel and the curators for coming and joining us. They've traveled in from farther than you guys have, so so we always appreciate that, and it's so valuable to have additional voices pull the work apart. So thank you so much. And yep, we've got refreshments upstairs. As always, we want to thank the Canada Council, the Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Peterborough for their generous and ongoing and sustained contribution to help us, and certainly regional galleries for the federal and provincial governments stay open for you guys. And please join us again on Thursday, where we've got Shop for Joy. So that we'll be opening the shop with our new winter stock at 2 and staying open until 9. And we've got baked goods or some food from Wendy Tressler and some mulled wine. So it's going to be a really great chance to come on in and warm up and get your holiday shopping started. Thanks, everyone.